Man, I thought Sarah and I were one of those couples you read about. The ones where even after years together, that stupid little spark is still there. You know, the cheesy stuff rom-coms make you believe in? Yeah, I was a total sucker for it. We were the sickeningly sweet high school pair who never grew out of that goofy stage where you can't keep your hands off each other. But lately, call it a gut feeling or whatever, but her energy had shifted. It started subtly enough, work trips popped up out of nowhere, stretching longer and longer. Date nights, more like cancelled nights, some lame excuse about a deadline or needing extra sleep. I tried to brush it off, but that flicker of doubt just wouldn't go away. And then, Christ, it still makes my stomach twist. I saw this smudge of lipstick on my coffee mug. Bright red, not Sarah's soft pink. My mind raced a coworker's makeup smudge, something from a night out with her girlfriends. I didn't say a damn word, just shoved it to the back of my mind. Cowardly? Yeah, absolutely. But the fantasy of our perfect little bubble was so much easier to cling to than the nagging dread in my chest. Then it came. The dreaded, we need to talk. You know when they say that line, it's never about the weather forecast. She hit me with the, I'm not happy anymore, bomb, and honestly? I wasn't just heartbroken, I was blindsided. Where the hell did this come from? I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. The words wouldn't come out, nothing. I just sat there, frozen. No tears, no screaming, nothing. Like someone had flicked my off switch, and all that was left was this empty buzzing inside. So, she goes from, I'm not happy, to shacked up with some meathead in under a week. Jake, remember that name? The douchebag from the gym. The guy who'd smirk at me whenever I was stuck on a treadmill beside him, all ripped and smug. Turns out it wasn't just my paranoia, he'd been scoping out Sarah, and now they were playing house. I didn't even know the guy's damn last name, just this looming image of muscle-bound smugness invading what was left of my life. My apartment, the one we decorated together with all those stupid inspirational quotes Sarah loved, was now this cavern of silence. Each throw pillow, each framed photo, felt like a mockery. I swore those damn live, laugh, love signs were flashing at me in neon, taunting me with my spectacular failure. So I did what any pathetic, heartbroken loser does. Worked myself to the bone, ordered enough greasy Chinese to clog an artery, and binged reruns of Friends, till the laughter track sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Pathetic, you bet. I knew I was circling the drain, and something rotten inside me wanted to go down screaming. I started hitting the gym too, not for any self-improvement crap, but out of some twisted need for revenge. Every pound I lifted was pure spite. I'd fantasize about crashing their cozy little world, exposing her for the liar she was, and giving Jake a taste of his own smug medicine. One night, after way too much cheap whiskey, I found myself outside their place. What was I even doing there? Spying on my own failed life? Torturing myself? Probably a bit of both. Seeing them together, laughing on the balcony, his hand resting way too casually on her hip, it wasn't just heartbreak anymore. White-hot rage sliced through me, the kind that makes you want to do something stupid, something violent. I could feel my nails digging into my palms, leaving little crescent moon scars. Something had snapped inside me. It wasn't just about her leaving, it was this gnawing fear that I was dissolving into nothingness, a pathetic ghost haunting his own life. That night, I vowed to stop being a victim, but whether that meant clawing my way back to sanity or embracing the darkness, I couldn't say. Look, I'm not proud of what I did next. Hell, I barely even recognized the guy the first was back then. But being replaced by some gym bro was bad enough. Watching my life fade into this pathetic punchline was unbearable. So, yeah, I stooped to stalker level. Figured their happy little bubble revolved around that pretentious gym where Jake was basically king of the squad rack. If I was going to witness my own misery, might as well go down in flames, right? The gym reeked of sweat and overpriced protein shakes, just as I imagined. Took me all of 5 minutes to spot them, sickeningly perfect in their matching workout gear. Sarah was actually laughing, her real laugh, the kind that warmed me from the inside out, the one I thought was gone forever. I hadn't seen that genuine spark of joy in her eyes for months, and now it was aimed at this human billboard for testosterone. Jake was exactly what I feared, a walking cliché of bulging biceps and smarmy charm. He had his hand on her shoulder, then her waist, then, well, let's just say I was surprised they didn't get kicked out for public indecency. That familiar knot of anger twisted in my gut, but this time with a bitter, acidic edge. It should have shattered me, seeing them like that. It should have confirmed every nasty assumption my brain had cooked up in my lonely echo chamber of an apartment. But somehow, it sparked something else. Not another breakdown, but a cold, calculating fury. I couldn't just let this play out, them winning and me reduced to a sad, forgotten footnote in Sarah's life. I would make them see, make them pay somehow. The exact how wasn't clear at that moment, just the certainty that I wasn't disappearing without a fight. Walking out of the gym, I felt almost lighter. My old self would have crumbled. This new, broken version of me? He was just getting started. Common sense screamed at me to get the hell out of there. I should have walked away from the gym and the whole sorry spectacle that was once my life. But instead, some masochistic force held me there, transfixed. I told myself it was research for the war I'd unwittingly been drafted into, knowing your enemy, playing the strategist, all that diluted crap. Truth is, I was addicted to my own pain, like picking at a scab even though you know it'll only bleed and scar worse. They'd moved to a bench by the weight racks, still nauseatingly touchy-feely but radiating a new kind of tension. Their smiles were gone, replaced by furrowed brows and worried glances. Jake, usually Mr. Cocky McMuscles, kept shifting uncomfortably, checking over his shoulder. Sarah, my joyful and carefree Sarah, had this tightness around her eyes I hadn't seen in years, something desperate and strained beneath the forced smiles. This wasn't just lovey-dovey post-workout bliss, something was seriously off. Straining to hear, I caught fragments. Words like bills, deadline, account sent a surge of adrenaline through me. My pulse quickened. Money. Sarah and I had always been open about finances. When we got married, I started handling her taxes and investments just to help out. Back when I thought love was enough, it felt good to use my accountant skills for someone other than soul-sucking corporate clients. Now, though, it felt more like a loaded weapon in my hands. My brain raced. Were they in debt because of some secret, lavish lifestyle Sarah had hidden from me? Extravagant gifts I unknowingly funded? Weekend getaways at my expense? It could explain the sudden change, the desperation I saw before me. But that same cynicism warned me I could be way off base, that this was some different kind of crisis I was ill-equipped to understand. Part of me, the still sane part deep down, screamed at me to forget it, to walk away. But that twisted, vengeful part? It latched onto this mystery like a starved dog with a bone. Maybe, just maybe, there was a flaw in their perfect little facade. A thread I could pull it, unravel their secrets, and use against them. That spark of hope, however toxic and self-destructive, was enough to keep me glued to that gym floor, waiting anxiously for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. That conversation at the gym gnawed at me for days. Every time I thought of Sarah's worried face, of Jake's uncharacteristic nervousness, my gut twisted with a confusing mix of anger and curiosity. What was going on? It wouldn't leave me alone, festering like an open wound in my already fractured life. The logical part of me, what little of it was left, kept saying this was none of my business. That invading Sarah's privacy, even out of spite, made me no better than her. But the voice of betrayal hissed louder. I'd always handled her finances ever since that first year of college when she flunked her accounting class and begged for my help. It turned into this side gig, helping my girl out, simplifying taxes, maxing out those retirement accounts. I'd assumed it was all on the up and up, that we were building our future together. Now, those happy memories were tinged with a sickly shade of doubt. Did I truly know how our money flowed? or had there been hidden cracks all along? Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Every night, it was the same loop. Images of Sarah and Jake, whispered worries about money, and a gnawing sense of betrayal twisting in my stomach. So, one sleepless, whiskey-fueled night, I did the unthinkable. I opened my old tax software, the one I swore I'd never touch again outside of work. At first, it was purely mindless. A bored accountant poking around familiar columns and spreadsheets. It should have been soothing, the predictable logic of numbers, a world where things added up. But this was Sarah's financial life laid bare, and every number was a potential bombshell. I started with the recent stuff, half expecting to find extravagant spending, coded hints at some secret double life Sarah had kept from me. Nothing. Just the usual. Groceries, car stuff, utilities. Boring, normal, heartbreakingly mundane. Disappointed, I was about to shut it all down when I remembered their hushed conversation, that sense of urgency. I dug deeper, backtracking through the previous year, searching for anything unusual. And there it was. A series of small transfers made out to an account I didn't recognize. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, a few hundred here, 1,000 there. But as the dates flickered past, the amounts grew bolder, the frequency alarming. A cold sweat broke out as I stared at the numbers dancing on the screen. Hidden transfers. Payments siphoned off month after month into some phantom account, a black hole draining away our future. My mind raced, a desperate search for innocent explanations. Maybe an early anniversary present for me, an emergency fund she hadn't told me about, a tax glitch I just didn't understand. But those flimsy excuses shattered against the sheer length of time it had been happening. This wasn't a surprise party or a bookkeeping hiccup, it was calculated deception. The rage that boiled up wasn't the fiery, impulsive kind from before. This was colder, a sickening sense of violation that seeped into my bones. Sarah, my sweet and honest Sarah, or so I'd idiotically believed. The thought of her lying, calculating, and stealing from me, because that's what it felt like now, made my stomach churn. Every sweet memory, every tender moment felt poisoned in hindsight. Had it all been just a performance, a carefully crafted play with me as the gullible audience of one? Days blurred together in a haze of shock, disbelief, and self-loathing. Had I been blind, a fool so in love that I missed the glaring red flags right in front of my nose? That little voice, the one usually drowned out by misplaced trust, whispered darker possibilities that made my blood run cold. Confronting Sarah seemed like the obvious thing to do, drag the truth out of her, however ugly. Part of me craved the drama of it, to throw those financial records at her, to watch that sweet mask crack and expose the liar underneath. But then what, would her tears be real? Could I ever believe a single word out of her mouth again? Another, more calculating part of me whispered to hold back, play dumb for now, dig deeper, gather irrefutable proof of how deep the deception ran. Then I could leverage it, make her hurt like she'd made me hurt. But did I really want to become that guy, vengeful, manipulative, trading in the currency of betrayal? The war in my head raged on. No matter what I chose, there were no clean endings. Whatever version of Sarah I uncovered, it wouldn't be the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I thought I knew. After days of sleepless, agonizing deliberation, fueled by equal parts whiskey and rage, I made my move. The smart part of my brain might have won out eventually, but those agonizing nights had worn me down to the raw nerve. I didn't want justice or some elaborate revenge scheme, I just wanted to lash out, make them feel a fraction of the blindsided misery I'd been living with. So, armed with a tube of Sarah's brightest red lipstick, the one she'd never worn around me, always saying it was too much, I ventured back into the shadows. Jake's obnoxious sports car was parked in its usual spot outside their love nest. With shaking hands, I scrawled 2 words across the windshield, I know. It was petty, pathetic, a move straight out of a B-rated revenge flick. But in that moment, as that vibrant red slashed across the pristine glass, a wave of twisted satisfaction washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tiniest flicker of control. It wasn't much, but in my fractured state, clinging to that pathetic illusion of power was just enough to get me through the night. As you might imagine, things escalated quickly from there. The next morning, my phone blew up with cryptic texts from an unknown number, filled with rage and unprintable insults. Jake had predictably lost his damn mind. Apparently, lipstick vandalism was enough to send his carefully balanced world crashing down. I imagined him foaming at the mouth, spitting accusations at Sarah, their unbreakable bond, dissolving faster than cheap hair dye. The fallout was exactly what I'd hoped for. Their picture-perfect romance was tainted, their bubble of smug happiness punctured by suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire through the gym, through every tight-knit group Sarah and I used to be part of. Each sideways glance, every whispered comment must have felt like a knife twisting in Sarah's gut. The vengeful part of me savored the chaos I'd inflicted. I knew this wouldn't fix anything, that I was just digging myself deeper into a pit of self-destruction. But after being kicked to the ground, watching them waltz off into my old life, there was a twisted comfort in knowing I could still trip them up, even if it meant getting my own hands dirty along the way. A pang of guilt stabbed at me the next day as I watched the fallout of my childish act unfurl. Seeing their relationship crumble did bring that sick sense of satisfaction, but a gnawing unease lingered. Sarah had hurt me, betrayed me, but destroying her new life didn't heal my own wounds. If anything, it made me feel smaller. This sense of guilt pushed me back into her finances, a desperate attempt to validate my rage. Surely there had to be something proving she was just a heartless gold digger, a justification for my petty revenge. Instead, I stumbled across the cold, hard truth. The transfers weren't going to some unknown lover or shady investment scheme. They were routed to a facility inexpensive, top-tier rehabilitation clinic. Not just anywhere, but one back in Sarah's hometown. A place hours away, the place where her close-knit family still lived. The realization hit me with crushing force, shattering my carefully constructed narrative of her betrayal. Had addiction, that shadowed beast, crept back into her life while I was obliviously wrapped up in our own little world? Were there whispers of trouble I'd ignored, desperate pleas swallowed by late-night work excuses and carefully practiced smiles? Or worse, was I so self-absorbed, so consumed by my own hurt, that I completely overlooked a family member, a brother, sister, maybe a parent, spiraling into crisis? Sarah, burdened by the devastating secret, forced to play this twisted double life. Shame flooded through me, burning away the righteous anger I'd clung to. The world shifted on its axis. I'd focused all my hatred on Jake, this shallow caricature of a man, while the real villain might be a silent battle Sarah fought alone. Those hidden accounts, the frantic worry on her face, was it all an act of love rather than cold deception? Every assumption I'd made, every vengeful fantasy, crumbled like sandcastles against a rising tide of confusion and the desperate need for answers. With those revelations echoing in my mind, and a desperate hope flickering to life, the only choice was to seek the truth face to face. I didn't bother packing. My apartment, once the center of my meticulously planned life, now felt like a hollow shell. All that mattered was finding Sarah, hearing it from her, even if the words cut me to the bone. Hours blurred together as I drove blindly toward her hometown. Each familiar landmark seemed warped, twisted by this new knowledge. The road trip playlist we used to blast on happy weekend getaways turned into a mocking soundtrack to my colossal failure as a husband, as a basic human being. My stomach was a knot of regret, fear, and the faintest tendril of fragile hope. Would she even want to see me? Was there anything left after the pain I'd caused with my accusations, my public humiliation of her? The rehab, a sprawling, intimidating complex set back amidst manicured lawns, was every bit as expensive as it looked online. Luxury and desperation existing side by side, a stark reminder of the battles fought in silence. A quick question at reception, and there I was. The pristine hallway seemed to stretch on forever, my footsteps echoing like a death march. Every step brought me closer to Sarah, and the potential final blow that would shatter what remained of my broken heart. She was on a sun-drenched balcony, a shadow of the vibrant woman I'd known. But it was her, no denying it. A wave of relief so sharp it was almost painful surged through me. Before I could even knock, her head whipped around, those familiar eyes locking onto mine. There was shock, disbelief, and yes, a flash of something akin to rage. I opened my mouth to apologize, to somehow explain this tangled mess, but she was the first to speak. "How could you?" Her voice cracked, raw with an anguish that mirrored my own. It hung in the air between us, echoing in the deafening silence. What I told her next spilled out in a torrent of desperate honesty. My discovery of the hidden money, the poisonous assumptions, the vindictive act of vandalism. It all came tumbling out in a rush. And then, the revelation of why I was there, why I'd driven like a maniac through the night to find her. Turns out, the love story wasn't over, just twisted so far out of shape it was unrecognizable. Her secret wasn't a new lover, but her little brother. Years of battling addiction, a relapse, and a family willing to sacrifice everything to save him. Sarah, my sweet Sarah, had been the one holding it all together, bearing the financial and emotional weight with quiet strength. Her words painted a picture of desperation and fierce familial love. It was a heartbreaking mirror to my own spiraling self-destruction. Every dollar I'd obsessed over wasn't a sign of her greed, but the lifeline keeping her brother afloat. Each whisper, every anxious glance I'd misinterpreted, was born from the terror of losing him. And Jake. Jake wasn't a romantic escape, but a desperate gamble. She'd latched onto his financial stability, his flashy surface, hoping to pump enough resources into her secret battle to finally win it. It was a Hail Mary pass, a flawed plan built on the ashes of her own happiness. Shame washed over me in waves. I'd judged her, condemned her, and publicly humiliated her when all along she'd been fighting a silent, lonely war. Every word of apology felt insufficient, a pathetic bandage on a gaping wound. Yet, she listened, not with forgiveness, that would take time, but with understanding dawning in her tear-streaked eyes. My apology wasn't a rehearsed speech, but a raw, agonizing confession. I laid out every poisonous suspicion that festered inside me, the petty acts of revenge, the complete unraveling of the man I thought I was. It was ugly and brutally honest, but in that moment of vulnerability, a bridge began to rebuild. It was fragile, cobbled together from shards of trust, but it was there. When I finally admitted I'd been the one to deface Jake's car, a flicker of amusement danced in her eyes. Not cruel, but the genuine, exasperated kind that couples exchange when one of them does something incredibly stupid. It felt strangely comforting, a tentative reminder of a time when we could be both tender and exasperated within the same breath. Helping her brother wasn't a selfless act of redemption on my part. It was the barest glimmer of decency, an attempt to claw back some shred of respect from the wreckage I'd created. We talked logistics, numbers, what could be salvaged, and where I could slot in without causing more destruction. There was no promise of forgiveness, no miraculous return to our old life. Only this. A willingness to face this new, fractured reality with a shared goal rather than tear each other further apart. As for Jake, turns out, Mr. Perfect wasn't so perfect after all. Once the truth about Sarah's brother and the financial strain she was under surfaced, he bailed faster than you can say, vows are worthless. It was pathetically predictable, a bitter confirmation of his shallowness. And honestly, Sarah was well rid of him. Life had handed her enough hardship, she didn't need a self-absorbed opportunist at her side. He'd get his, eventually. Because as cliché as it sounds, karma has a wicked sense of humor, and as we walked along the pier holding hands, I looked at my wife, Natalie. Even though we were approaching 50, she was still as beautiful to me as ever. Perhaps we needed to do more things together to rekindle the flame of love, but the embers were still alive. I looked back at the parking lot to make sure my other great love, my 2013 Mustang Boss 302, was still in order. Then I took Natalie's hand and we began to stroll down the dock. In addition to other strollers, there were a lot of people on the dock. There was gambling, different kinds of food, and lots of entertainers. I saw jugglers, stilt walkers, singers, musicians, clowns, and even a mime. I hate mimes. We didn't make any specific plans or schedule. We just wanted to spend the day together and rediscover all that we had lost. I didn't think we had lost anything. Perhaps I perceived it as a case where over time, our blazing romance had simply cooled down to a level that we could sustain for a longer period of time. It was as if Natalie thought we still had to constantly smack each other like we did when we first met. We had been together for a long time, and were no longer young and fresh. That didn't mean I loved her any less, or that I was less attracted to her. In fact, I probably loved her even more. Over the years, we became more and more important to each other. We became part of each other's lives. It would be much harder for me to leave her now than it would have been shortly after we met. My perspective on all of this was different from hers. She believed that we had lost the passion in our relationship. I was sure we had lost only despair and insecurity. I took Natalie's hand and pulled her closer to the water as the mime approached us. "Take that, Marcel," I thought with an evil smirk on my face. Apparently he was a better mime than I thought he was, because he managed to convey how he was that he'd been ripped off just by the look on his face. "Oh, let's take a tour of the lake." Natalie giggled. "That looks interesting." I looked at the boat with a mixture of skepticism and outright contempt. The boat didn't seem very seaworthy. "Come on, Rob, it'll be fun," Natalie coaxed, her voice sounding more like the young woman I'd fallen in love with than the one I'd been in recent years. I looked at the boat again. This time I looked at the crew of two. The captain looked like a former athlete who had gone soft. He still had his former mass, but he hadn't retained the definition and hardness of his muscles. He tipped his hat and smiled at us. His long greasy hair and yellow-toothed smile reminded me more of a biker's mom than any sense of seamanship. The only person who made me feel safe was his crewman. This guy was one of the people who blew it. Even as he was walking up the gangway to stand next to the captain, who was standing at the safety rail on deck, he tripped over seemingly nothing and almost fell overboard. And the boat itself, was it called the Guppy? It looked like it was left over from the war, the Revolutionary War. "There's no way I'm getting on that boat." "Come on, Rob," she said. "I need my big, strong husband to protect me from the dangers of the sea." "Don't worry, sir," said the captain. "This is just a quick tour of some of the interesting places around the Great Lakes. We'll show you the coolest hidden islands and the most famous shipwrecks in history." "Are you showing the area where the Edmund Fitzgerald sank?" I asked. "Are you high?" he asked. "I've been swimming in these waters since I was 12 and I'm still scared of this place." He looked at me like there was something wrong with me. I noticed that Natalie was looking at me too, like I had done something wrong. I was about to just take her hand and head home, but then a crew member intervened. "What I like is all the mysterious islands in the lakes," he said. "Some of them are undiscovered and some of them are haunted. One of them is said to have an Indian chief living on it that boats can't get near because of the high winds and crazy waves. Perhaps we can sail past it, but aren't we in danger of drowning?" said I. "This boat doesn't seem to be very seaworthy." "No," said the captain. "This island is only dangerous in November. In summer, like now, it is perfectly safe. But a few months will pass and the place will be like hell on earth. The winds there blow so hard they strip the paint off the hull. I've heard of waves 50 feet high coming out of nowhere, moving like freight trains." "Wow, have you ever seen one of those?" I asked. He stared at me again like a runaway idiot. "If that were the case, I wouldn't be talking to you right now," he said. Again, I noticed that my wife seemed to be on the side of this cheesy tuna-smelling boat jockey. There's a rumor that this Indian, Native American, is some kind of shaman and he's in love with the spirit of the Great Lakes. I've heard of strange purple lightning and otherworldly screams coming from there in the fall. Some people say it was conditions like that that ruined the Fitzgerald. I've also heard that the storm followed the ship from the island to its final resting place. So we may not go to where the Fitz is sank, but we might go near the island. I nodded my head and paid for the tour. I figured if I had to spend the next 3 hours with my cheating wife, I might as well do something interesting. I looked at the passengers who were already on board and saw that they could be described as a truly motley crew. There was a group of 4 women in their mid-20s who were already starting to whisper and giggle. 2 of them were quite pleasant-looking, if not average. The other 2 also fit the expected stereotypes. One was a tall, well-built blonde goddess who needed to check her lipstick every 17 seconds. I imagined that she actually pulls out her makeup bag and looks away from everyone every so often because she uses the mirror to look around and make sure everyone can see her. The last in their company was, of course, the fat girl. Though not comically obese, she was rather denser than all her friends and she was obviously worried about it. She wore pants instead of shorts and a long-sleeved blouse to cover her fat arms. But of course, in the good old tradition of her kind, the blouse was cut low enough to emphasize the virtues she was most proud of. Somewhere near the chatting women sat a guy. That's the only way I can describe him. He was just a regular guy. If I wasn't already me, I would have thought that's what he was. Like me. He was in his early 40s. He was of average height and build, neither thin nor fat. His hair, like mine, was brown and had not yet had time to go bald or gray. In short, he was a regular guy. There was another woman standing next to the guy. It was a very light-skinned black woman. It looked like she was alone. She was very attractive and could probably be very pretty if she put on makeup or something. Her long, thick and silky hair was swept back away from her face and tied up in a very severe bundle. The clothes she was wearing were very loose and didn't emphasize or take anything away from her body. I also could not make out the contours of her figure, but I could tell from her arms and hands that she was relatively thin. Across from her, but clearly not with her, sat 2 nerds. They were both small in stature with huge glasses. And were discussing something that looked like schoolwork. The captain and his first mate began preparing the boat to leave the dock. Just as they began to untie the ropes holding the boat to the dock, 2 more guys appeared. They each handed the captain a few bills and then climbed aboard the boat. They looked around and settled down next to the women. They were both big guys and both relatively young. One of them walked around looking like he thought he ruled the world and the other was his assistant. It seemed as if the second guy was paid to agree with everything the big blonde guy said. I noticed that Natalie seemed to take a particular interest in the last 2 arrivals, much more than anyone else on board. I got up, went and sat at the other end of the boat. After a few minutes she came over and sat down next to me. "Nat, maybe you should go back to where you were sitting?" I said. "Why, Rob?" she asked. "I'm beginning to see where you're going with this," I said. "Maybe we've grown distant from each other over the years. I guess I never noticed it. I always thought things were fine between us. I guess I thought we still loved each other and even though we've gotten older, we're still the same people." "But we're the same people," she said. "Maybe we've made some mistakes. Maybe we've prioritized something in our marriage and we need to get back to what's most important." That's what today was about. We just need to spend more time together and rediscover what we fell in love with. We need to put the past behind us and step into the future together. I think we've grown a little bit apart, but not so much that we're the same. I looked at her and she seemed sincere. She seemed to be begging for it, but I didn't understand. "Well, if we're different," I began. "Maybe we should do what Steve and Edie did." "Rob, we don't need this," she said. "Our case is nothing like theirs, and I don't know if you're in touch with Steve, but Edith is miserable. All the she's been through has aged her prematurely, and she's not happy anymore. We just need to get to know the people we've become over the years," she said. She put her arm around me and rubbed her hand against my cheek like she did when we first started dating. I sighed, realizing that it had been years since she had done that. It was amazing how much such small gestures could mean. I wanted us to discuss something today, she said. But maybe with the mood we're in right now, it'll have to wait. Let's just have a good time and see if the captain and his Great Lakes scary tour can entertain us. We can talk about anything, whatever it is, I said. I'm in no mood for nonsense. I'll take my bad news straight, Rob. It's not that when people are together for a long time, they take life at different speeds and… You mean we're estranged, which you've been hinting at all morning? I snapped back. And to make a long story short, you're sick of us and you want a divorce? And since the kids are already out of the house and in college, now seems like a good time. She looked at me with absolute terror in her eyes. Rob, what makes you think I want this? She asked. You should know that more than anything, I want us to be together. She took my hands in hers and looked into my eyes. Rob, we've done our duty to the community. We raised 2 wonderful children. Sure, we've both made some mistakes, but you're still the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. And I can't say I said what kind of woman is that who constantly takes the side of another man over her husband. I'm not sure I want to be married to a woman like that. What are you saying, Rob? You're not jealous of me for the captain, are you? She laughed and squeezed my hand even tighter. Rob, I was just about to tell you that we've raised the kids, our mortgage is quite affordable, and we did it before we turned 50. We're riding the trade train and heading for the finish line. But I think we're looking at things differently. I think you want us to keep saving and you intend to keep chugging along at your job for another 18 years until you're ready to retire at 65. That's what normal people do, I said. She interrupted me with a look. That's why normal people die or get too old to do anything with their lives. Snarled today is the beginning for us, Rob. It's not the end. I'm not telling you I want a divorce. I'm telling you I want us to get to know each other anew. I want you to cut back on your hours and start using the vacation time you have. I want us to take trips, go camping, and visit all the curiosities we hear about. I want you to make me remember why all my girlfriends think you are so special and so cute. I want us to spend the rest of our lives falling in love with each other all over again. Before I could answer her, there was an explosion of vibration and engine noise as the good ship Guppy pulled away from the dock. The motion of the vessel was not as smooth as one might expect. But the captain and his mates seemed to be used to it. As we moved farther and farther away from shore safety and my Mustang, I became accustomed to the erratic nature of the boat. It's not a car, I said to myself. Therefore, I shouldn't expect it to feel like a car. Lake Superior is huge in terms of surface area. It is the largest freshwater lake in the world. It is also the world's largest real lake. Only the Caspian Sea, which is not really a lake, is bigger than it. It is a sea, but because it is completely surrounded by land. It meets the definition of a lake to a small extent. The lake is so large that if we were lost, it would take days or weeks to find us. The lake is over 36,000 square miles, an area that's a huge area to search, said the captain. He talked at length about how the lake touched 3 separate states and an entire country. But don't be afraid, boys, he said, grinning. I know this lake as well as I know my own bathtub. This made most of the passengers, including Natalie, laugh, but it didn't affect me much. I had 2 different thoughts. The first was that the captain had a rather unpleasant fishy odor. His first mate didn't have one, so perhaps the captain didn't know his tub that well. The second thought was that perhaps the lake was the captain's bathtub. That would explain why he smelled like bloody fish. True to his word, for at least the first hour and a bit more, we drove in the same direction. From the starting point, I noticed a few minor course changes depending on the position of the sun. But the more we drove, the more I was fascinated by the captain's stories about the Great Lakes. Several times during our excursion I noticed first mate Gil looking up at the sky. As I mentioned, the movement of the guppy through the water was never smooth, but after about 80 minutes I noticed that the swell of the water and the roughness of the guppy's movements had increased dramatically. When we first set off, the sun was high in the sky and there were few clouds. The sun had set behind the clouds several times during the trip, and in the heat of the day we were glad for a respite from the sun's rays. But now the whole sky was filled with dark, angry clouds. I realized that Jill had seen these clouds far and wide, and they were the ones he was watching. "I hate to interrupt our excursion," said the captain, "but we are quite close to the mysterious island I warned some of you about. The waters approaching this island are known for their unpredictability. And even though we can't see the island, Superior seems to be freaking out." Perhaps I should not have spoken of this island aloud. At first, I thought he was just ramping up the drama to cover up his ineptitude. What sailor doesn't keep an eye on the weather? Even Jill, who I was sure wasn't too tightly wrapped, noticed the clouds. But even as the captain spoke, lightning flashed very close to the ship. Huge drops of rain suddenly began to fall on the water, and all the passengers left the deck and went to the cramped crew quarters below deck. The weather started to pick up and the little boat was tossing around. I had to give credit to the captain and Gil. They were doing their job courageously, and it was they, more than anyone else, who kept the boat from going down. Wait, I should rephrase that. Perhaps it would be better, or at least clearer, if I said the weather began to turn bad. The tiny vessel was tossing about. Had it not been for the bravery of the intrepid crew, the minnow that is the guppy would have perished. Looking at the frightened and angry faces of the passengers around me, I realized that we were all already regretting getting on the guppy. I heard several people say the same thing I did. They expressed the same concerns. The boat didn't look in the best condition and the captain smelled like fish. Jill seemed like an idiot at best, and now our lives were in their hands. "I'm going to sue," one of the women said. "Who are you going to sue?" The man I called just a guy asked. "The captain probably owns the boat, and apparently the boat is all he owns. If the boat goes down, what do you get? Maybe you get ownership of a sunken, worthless boat." "Yeah, and then they'll charge you all sorts of fines for cleaning it up so you don't damage the lake's ecosystem and stuff like that," one of the nerds said. The nerd next to him didn't utter a word. He just turned green and ran over to the small galley sink. He immediately emptied the contents of his stomach and did so very loudly. He may have been the only one throwing up. But he wasn't the only one who wasn't enjoying the trip. As the boat rose and fell and crashed against the waves, we all screamed and begged for the trip to be over. "Are we anywhere near the island you told us about?" I asked, scared out of my wits. "No," said the captain, "this island is at least half an hour away from us." Over the next few minutes the passage of time and my senses seemed to go crazy. I looked at my watch, and although it seemed like hours had passed, it was more like 5 minutes. The usual up and down motion that the boat made as it traveled through the water was gone. The boat was now moving in all directions and orientations and seemed to be haphazard. The bow of the boat was often pointing straight up and sometimes straight down and at an angle. We were tossed around the cabin and slammed against the walls, seemingly with some malicious external intent. Natalie clung to me as best she could and I did my best to reassure her that everything was going to be all right. We weren't so much talking as we were rambling over phrases. We'd bounce off the wall and I'd say, "Wow, that was intense." Then we'd slide to the floor and I'd yell, "They're making us move forward." I tried to be manly. I did it more for her sake than for my own. I noticed, however, that many of the men had gone wild. The big muscular guy squealed like a little girl, but I couldn't take offense at him. He was young and realized that he and all of us could die. Letting it all out was helpful. The nerds were screaming too. The women were screaming almost as loud as the muscular guy. Then I noticed 2 things. First, a guy who looked like me was doing the same thing I was doing. He was looking for the best and strongest places on the boat to hold on to and positioning himself so as to increase the security of his position with every movement of the boat. A single woman was doing the same thing. It struck me more than anything else. After that, I was too shocked to notice anything as the boat hit something very hard and a huge ripping sound overrode everything else. I looked at the wall opposite me and saw a huge hole in my side with water pouring through it. "We've got to get out of here," I shouted. "Come on, back on deck with that big hole in the side, this boat is going to go down." As soon as I said this, a muscular fellow squeezed past the women, jerked open the door and ran out. On deck, I helped one of the plain women to her feet and at the same time I helped the fat woman to her feet. Then I lifted Natalie onto the deck. The captain didn't insist that we put on life jackets, and I started looking for where they were kept. "What do we do now?" the muscular guy asked me. He looked scared. "I'm trying to find life jackets in case we have to go down into the water," I said. "Yeah, me too," he said. He started opening cabinets. The captain and Gil were busy trying to find something to patch the hole in the ship and trying to radio someone to relay our situation and request help. I pulled out my cell phone and noticed there was no signal. The rain had eased, but the strong wind was still rattling the boat like a cork in a bathtub. Adding to that the fact that the boat had a very clear listing, I think we all got a little scared. One of the women found the life jackets. "I found them," she shouted. A muscular guy quickly walked over to her, pushed her aside and then grabbed a life jacket. He quickly put it on and then started handing them out to everyone else. Just then the boat hit something very hard. The impact was so hard that we were all knocked off our feet. I saw the captain literally fly out from under my feet and land unsuccessfully on his upper back and shoulders. When he landed, there was an eerie cracking sound and then he was left lying motionless. We all grabbed onto something to hold on to. Natalie grabbed me and sat next to me whimpering for several long scary moments. At this time we noticed that the boat had stopped moving. I crawled over to the captain and called for Gil. I groped the captain's neck until I was sure he had no pulse. Then I looked at Jill and shook my head. "The captain's dead, isn't he?" wheezed the muscular guy. I nodded. "Oh, this is just great," he whined. "How the hell are we supposed to get home now?" I looked around and noticed that the boat had indeed run aground. I climbed over the side and noticed that we were on a fairly large piece of land that we had somehow stumbled upon during the storm. The rest of us climbed out of the boat too and followed me. We were on a fairly large beach. "Jill, do you think there's any chance of patching the hole in the side of the boat?" I asked. He just looked at me. "What the hell are you asking him for?" the muscular guy asked. "Well, because he's the captain now, so he's in charge. We need to make a plan and figure out how the hell we're going to get off this island or signal the authorities to let them know we're here." I said, "We don't have to do any of that, Grandpa," he said. "It's all automatic now. As soon as the company notices that communication with one of their ships has broken down, they'll track us down. All we have to do is sit and wait. To tell you the truth, I don't trust a word this says. He and his buddy almost got us killed. That guy was a real captain." I ignored him and started walking along the beach. As I walked away from the group, I noticed that I was being followed. I turned around and saw that Jill, a guy, and a pretty black woman were following me. The guy, who was just a guy, caught up with me. "Are you scouting the island?" he asked. I nodded. "We need to know what's here in case the rescue the steroid guy was talking about doesn't come. I know it's stupid, but there's not supposed to be a storm this afternoon. It's supposed to be tonight and tomorrow afternoon," I said. "George Ignakovsky," he said, extending his hand. "Robert Sinclair," I said. "George, I think we'll cover more ground if we split into 2 teams. Gil and I will go east and you and this lady will go west. Does your watch still work?" "Yes," he said. Let's meet at the beach in an hour. It won't be more than 3 or 4 hours before the sun sets. The storm will surely have started by then, if it hasn't already. We're looking for a cave or any other natural formation where we can build a shelter in a short time. He nodded and we left. As Jill and I moved around the island, he seemed to come out of his shock. How do you know this way is the eastern way? He asked. The sun sets in the west, I said. He nodded. You learned that in a survival course, right? He asked. No, I watched a lot of cowboy movies as a kid. I smiled. We saw several natural rock formations that might be suitable, but we would need some materials to make them livable. We spotted many thin but sturdy trees and a few large trees from which we could cut or break off long, thin branches. From talking to Jill, I got a pretty good idea of what supplies and tools were available on board the boat. So after an hour I had a pretty good idea of what we needed to do to survive the storm. In relative comfort, I sent Jill back to the boat with a list of things to grab and bring. I went back to the beach to explain what we had found and tell him the plan. Unless George offered a better place, we would make do with what I had. Time was running out, so we needed to do something fast. I was only gone for about an hour and it was probably pure luck that I took the exact route I came back on. This area was a bit more wooded than the others. I found out later that they decided to use the safety in numbers strategy, so whenever someone needed to go to the bathroom, 2 people would go there. All the women went in twos, unfortunately, or perhaps out of calculation. When Natalie went, there were no women available, so she went with him. I could hear their conversation as I approached them. I didn't try to walk quietly until I heard her voice. But aren't you married? He asked her. This is nothing new, she says. I've been expanding my horizons for a few years now. My friend got caught and I decided to quit, but maybe this isn't the right time for that. Then I heard a chugging sound I recognized all too easily. I knew what was going on, and I knew what I heard, but somehow it wasn't enough. I crept closer and saw my wife. I almost thought she heard me, but she looked in the direction they came from. I saw her looking toward the beach, checking to see if everything was in place. Why did you stop? He asked. We're just getting started. Just remember that younger girls are prettier, she said. But they're not going to do all the things I'm going to do. What about your husband? He snorted. What he doesn't know won't hurt him, she said. You can always give him something to do to make him feel important, like sending him out on a scouting mission or something. I guess I should have been shocked, but as soon as she told me that, she'd been deceiving me for years. Everything fell into place. I realized the reason why she suddenly decided we needed to open up to each other again, and everything made sense. She twirled with Edie, and when Edie got caught, Natalie didn't. She saw how Edie ended up and she didn't want that to happen to her, so she ran the whole rekindled affair thing on me. Even more painful than the betrayal itself was that she did it so coldly she didn't even think about me being a practical man. I put it behind me. Heartbroken or not, the storm was still coming. I walked away from the woods and approached the beach from the other side. As I approached the beach, I saw George and the woman he had left with coming from the other side. We met in the center and George shook his head. We found a small cave, he said, but it's hardly spacious enough for all of us. The woman tugged at his sleeve. Oh yes, we found some berry trees. Some of them are ripe. I saw a bunch of squirrels. Jill and I have found a natural ledge of rock that will do for this night. We can use some tarps that Jill said they had on board and some rope. We'll need to make some sort of framework to reinforce the tarps and use them as walls to keep the storm from blowing them away, but we'll need to get started on that pretty soon, so we don't do anything like that, came a voice from behind me. While you guys were on your little hunting expedition, we had an election. After all, this is still the United States, and I'm in charge here. I noticed the 2 nerds and the idiot's friend nod their heads in agreement. So did the other 4 women. So we can't vote. George asked. It wouldn't matter, the muscular guy said. There are only 4 of you. There were 9 people here. Anyway, I've decided that if the rescuers don't arrive tonight, which I'm sure they will, we'll just spend the night on the boat. Why would we waste time, energy, and effort building something when we have a boat? George and I shrugged and headed to the spot I had chosen. Hey, the muscular guy shouted. Where are you going? There's a storm coming, I said. We don't have time to waste on you. But I'm in charge here, he said. We didn't vote for you, so you're not responsible for us, George said. What about your wife? Shouted the guy. She's with us. Don't you want to try to persuade her to come with you, or try to fight for her? You already said that, I said she's with you. I looked straight into Natalie's eyes, and she sighed. I only fight for what I think is worth it. But Rob? Natalie whined. George, the quiet woman, and I began to walk away from the beach. As we walked away, a stocky woman ran toward us. Dana, where are you going? One of the women asked. Look, Peggy, I already know how this movie ends, Dana said. 4 guys, 5 women, and me, the fat lady. I'll take my chances on the other side. Truth be told, they seem to have a plan, and they have a reason for it, I hope. Once we got to the place I had found earlier, we all introduced ourselves. The stocky girl's name was Dana. The quiet one was Ella. Ella was wonderful. She didn't talk much because she didn't like to explain her accent. She was a mutt, as she called herself. Her father was half black, half Hispanic. Her mother was Irish who lived in England. Ella grew up in London and had an accent. She was a librarian and was very proud of it. George, like me, was an engineer. The difference was that he was a mechanic and I was a production engineer. I told him about my idea of how to strengthen the site. The spot I had chosen was on the side of a relatively steep hill. On one side of the hill was a vertical indentation. It resembled the letter V turned on its side. The idea was to build a rather large canopy that would take advantage of the sheer wall against its back and blend in with the hillside. As a bonus, there were a few large rocks and fallen trees that we could put in front of it when we got settled to further protect it from the wind. Since the tarp was waterproof, I wasn't as worried about the rain as I was about the wind. Jill arrived shortly thereafter and we filled it. The tarp was bigger than I expected, and thicker. We filled it and I sent it off for another trip. George decided to start the construction. Dana and I went looking for limbs to staple together to build the walls, and Ella went back to picking berries she had seen earlier and anything edible she could find. While Dana and I looked for appropriately sized limbs. We talked and I kept an eye out for small pieces of dry wood. I expected that it might get cold at night, so I asked Jill to bring a couple of things I had seen on the boat that might be useful for making a fire. Ella returned with more than enough berries for the 5 of us. I jabbed my finger at her, and she smiled and came over to me. I held out the fishing rod to her. What should I use as bait? She asked. The precise syllables of her words were magical. What did you say? I asked. She smiled and repeated her question. I pretended again that I hadn't heard her. Dana came over and said that George had enough poles for the 2 layers of wall we needed. Does it have to do with color? Ella asked. What do you mean? Asked I asked you the same question 2 or 3 times, but you didn't hear me, she said. But when Dana came up, you heard her right away, answered her question, and sent her away. I'm sorry, I said. And it's not about skin color. Hell, your skin is probably lighter in color than mine. So it's a cultural trait? She asked, looking at me like she was very disappointed. Ella, that's stupid, I said. And I'm sorry you think I'm a fool. She sighed. I'll tell you, my good man. I burst into laughter then. Ella, I never said you were stupid. I laughed. I meant that I am. She calmed down and looked at me. I doubt very much that you are stupid, she said. And since we're all following your plan, if I'm wrong, we'll all suffer. Ella, I kept making you repeat yourself because I love hearing you speak. I said. Your accent, your tone of voice, even the phrases you use are just magical. I could listen to you speak forever. We both blushed and walked away. Ella. I called out as she raised the pole. There are all sorts of worms on the ground near some of the muddy areas. Try using them and also berries as bait. After a few minutes she came over, took my hand and pulled me toward the puddle. Put this on my hook, she said, pointing to a big fat worm. George started driving the long spars into the hillside. If you looked from a distance, you could hardly see them because he was very precise in his approach to the corner of the hill. The next step would be to lay the tarp over them and then another layer of spars to protect the tarp from the strong winds. I asked Jill to take the big flat metal disc he had brought from the boat and put it in the center of the big fire pit too. I put in a lot of crumpled paper, brushwood, and pieces of dry wood. I had collected a few neatly stacked metal skewers and we had both heat and a stove. On his last trip, Jill had taken several bottles of water and 3 cans of soda with him. Clouds began to fill the sky. We all had to push a large rock and a split stump in front of the wall. Together. We made blankets out of small pieces of tarpaulin. We also had life jackets that we stretched out and piled up to serve as mattresses. Finally, when Ella approached us carrying 3 decent-sized fish, everything was ready. That's all I caught, she said. I have them, George said. I'm filleting them. I asked Jill to get the first one off the hook, Ella said proudly. I noticed that the other 2 fish were still tied to the lines on the poles. Ella reached for me after George had freed her from the fish and rods. I'll only eat berries, she said. I just don't like sushi. Well, not a sushi girl, I said. What do you think of this? I pointed to my makeshift stove. I don't know. What is it? She asked. We'll cook the fish you caught there. I smiled at her. Clever boy. She smiled back. I may have to eat some of that after all. Ella, we really don't know how long we'll be here. We won't be able to survive and keep our strength up with just berries and greens. So when any kind of protein shows up, eat it, whether it's fish or squirrel or anything else we find. Even if it tastes like fried, eat it, okay? She nodded. Rob. She called out. I turned and looked at her. I was just wondering, she said in her musical voice. What exactly does fried look like? We both burst into laughter and soon everyone came over to see what was so funny. Before we could explain, we felt the first drops of rain. We went inside our hastily built structure. We left the flat behind the rocks open but pushed the log as close as possible. After several attempts, I lit a fire with a lighter. The small fire and the open flap provided some light. I took a skewer and threaded on it Ella's fish which George had filleted. I turned them very slowly every few moments. The smell of cooking fish was tantalizing. While we waited for the fish to cook, we took turns telling the others about ourselves. Dana was full of questions. I feel good, she said. Considering the circumstances. I feel very good. But why didn't we want to wait out the storm in the boat with the others? Because the boat is sitting very precariously on the very shard of rock that split her hull, I said. She's unstable. As soon as the wind and the tide come in, either one of them could lift the boat off that rock, I said. Are you saying they can sail away without us? She asked. I mean, they could swim right to the bottom of the lake, I said. The lake is over 1,000 feet deep in some places, Jill says. What about your wife? Ella asked. I'm sure she can swim, I said. Only silence and the crackle of a small flame filled the tent. Everyone looked away from me in embarrassment. Listen, guys, I said. Natalie and I were supposed to spend today getting to know each other again. I didn't think we needed it. It was her idea. A couple hours ago, I caught her doing something she shouldn't have done if she wanted to stay married to me. I also overheard her telling the person she was doing it with about how she had been cheating on me for several years. Oh, as far as I'm concerned, whether we get off this island or are stuck here for years to come, our marriage is over. It wasn't love that suddenly made her want to get close to us. It was fear of being caught mixed with guilt. In a way, I'm glad I found out. Now I can get rid of her and find someone else to spend the rest of my life with before I'm too old to start over. So get rid of the bad garbage. Let's eat. We ate fish and berries, drank water or soda, and talked about other things, including what we would do the next day. Until we fell asleep to the howling wind and rain whipping through the canopy. We built it well, so we stayed warm and dry. The next morning we all got up to do the chores we had decided to do the night before. Dana had to level and tidy up the shed. Ella did the fishing. George was hunting for any small game he could find and for berries. Gil and I were going to try to make some kind of signal that would be visible to passing ships. Dana also wanted to visit her friends. Gil, George and I, having gathered our thoughts, came up with two practical ideas for signaling devices. One was to build a bonfire that could be lit instantly and would give both fire and smoke. The bonfire would be clearly visible at night, but the smoke would be much more noticeable during daylight hours. We also decided to try to get a large head mirror into the boat. This would be a great way to signal during the day, and it didn't require a fire or power source. We decided to head to the mirror first. When we got to the beach, we first thought that maybe they were still on the ship. Then we saw that they were all huddled around a tree, trying to hug each other to keep warm. I knew they would dry out during the heat of the day, but it was still a little chilly and they looked like they were freezing. Then we noticed the boat was gone. They saw us about the same time we realized the boat had sunk. Natalie and one of the young women stood up and staggered toward us. One of the botanists was walking with them. They looked terrible. "Why didn't you tell us the boat was going to sink?" the botanist asked. "You knew, didn't you? How are you guys drying off?" Natalie asked. I ignored her. "Rob, we need to talk, honey," she said. "I get the feeling you're angry about something." Okay, I did it again. I didn't take your side. Obviously, I was wrong. "And Jill, let's swim out and see how far the boat is below the surface," I said. "We can always dry our clothes by the fire. Hopefully they'll have something to eat when we get back." Everyone else turned their heads in our direction when I said that. "Where'd you get the food?" the muscular fellow asked through clattering teeth. "You stole all the food off the boat, didn't you?" "Of course not," said Jill. "There's plenty of food on the island. You just have to know what to look for and work together to get it." "Show us," said Mr. Muscle. "We have things to do," I said. "Since you're in charge here, you should get off your and figure out the next move." But as I recall from the weather forecast, it's supposed to rain again today. "What does it mean to work together?" one of the nerds asked. "We all have different jobs in different parts of the plan," I told them. "Some of us are in the business of cleaning up the area. Others are working on getting food. Some of us will be working on how to signal the boats from a long distance. You've obviously taken away all the good people, Mr. Tone. Muscle said that's not fair. You left me a bunch of useless women and nerds," he continued. "I thought nerds were supposed to be smart, and these guys only know comic books and Lord of the Rings. It's really unfair. We should all get together and be one group again." "I'll talk to the rest of our group at lunch and see what they have to say," I said. "Why don't you just tell them?" he said. "Because no one in our group is calling the shots," I said. "We discuss things and act on the ideas we think will work. We all have an opinion and we all have a job to do. Why aren't you guys wet? The blonde asked. Her makeup was running down her face, she was cold, and she looked just awful. Our shelter is dry and windproof, Jill said. And we're all very warm by the fire. Where did you find shelter? Mr. Muscle asked. We didn't find it, we built it, Jill says. Rob came up with the design. Egg. That's what we called George Ignakovsky. Egg built it. Dana made it comfortable. We're clearly having fun with the wrong guys, the blonde hissed. Jill and I dove into the water and swam to the rocky edge of the island. The boat was there, but it was at least 8 feet below the surface of the water. I took a deep breath and swam down. I stayed underwater as long as I could, but I never managed to get into the head behind the mirror. Jill, however, did much better than I did. He came up with a little hibachi grill. Not that I didn't like the way you cooked last night, he said, but it'll be a lot easier this way. The other group started to follow us as we left. I turned and spoke to them less than 24 hours ago. You all made some very stupid decisions, I said. You're all lucky you didn't drown when the boat went down. I'll talk to our group and see what they have to say about getting back together. We'll let you know. Natalie was still watching me. Where are you going? I asked. With you, she said. We're married, remember? In the coldest voice I could muster. I told her yesterday, when you were entertaining, that you told him that what I didn't know wouldn't hurt me. You were wrong. That I know now, and it doesn't hurt me much. I'm ready to put you in the past behind me. As soon as we get off this island, we'll be divorced. It's over between us. She just stood there in shock as Jill and I walked away. For the next 3 days, both groups had minimal contact. My group thrived. We found a way to use several long sections of pipe from the ship as makeshift tubes. This allowed us to stay underwater long enough to retrieve the mirror and a few other necessities. The only real contact between the two groups came from Dana. She visited her friends every day and came back with horror stories. The other group was supposedly near starvation and despair. Troy, the guy with all the muscles, turned into a pocket tyrant. He ruled his group through fear and intimidation. All the women except Natalie wanted to move to our group but were afraid Troy would do it. Dana looked at me when she said Natalie was depressed. I'm not saying it's your fault, she said, but she seems to think you just wrote her off. Yes, I said. What else was I supposed to do? How would you feel if you found out that for the last 20-odd years you've been working for the good of a man? You loved him with all your heart, you've done everything you could to make him happy, and suddenly you find out that he's been cheating on you for years? Damn, I wish I could start the divorce while we're on this island so I could get rid of her even sooner. Don't you want to talk to her? Dana asked. Don't you want to know why this happened? What does that change? I asked. Why she did what she did is irrelevant. The fact that she did it and more than once tells me that I don't want to be married to her anymore. I'm just lucky I found a woman like that. It's over. I'm not going to turn into a bitter old man who hates all women. I'm sure I'll find someone who looks at things the same way I do. That morning I got up early to head to our section of rock that was closest to the water. We roughly shared the island with another group. The beach was on their section. It was a good deal because most of the fish seemed to stay away from the beach, but there were plenty of them around our cliff. As I approached the cliff to check the pole we had set up in the rock to attach a large mirror to it, I noticed Ella. She was sitting on the edge of the cliff catching fish. Over the past few days we've split into pairs, with the exception of Gil. Dana and IGG seemed to be spending a lot of time together and Ella seemed to be looking for me most of the time. We sat together at meals and at night she slept next to me, often rolling over onto her back when it got chilly. But that was about as far as we got. I wasn't sure I could say the same about Iga and Dana, despite their age difference. I was just about to walk over to her when I saw them. Troy, his buddy, and the two nerds came out of the woods that separated the beach from our neighborhood. They headed straight for Ella. Troy grabbed her arm and tried to pull her in the direction they came from. I ran as fast as I could and didn't slow down until I reached them. I pushed Troy away from her and stood between them. "What are you doing, old man?" Troy asked. "It's not your part of the island," I said. "We kind of have an unspoken agreement since we don't believe in each other's ideas." While I was talking, Natalie and the young women approached. On the other side came Dana, IGG, and Gil. "This is the side Gil, IGG, and I chose while you sat on your fat steroid and told us we were wasting our time. This is the land of Gillig and I mean this is the land of Gillig and me. This is the land of Dana and Ella. Your place is on the other side." "Did he say it was Gilligan's Island?" one of the women asked. "I'm tired of all this," Troy shouted. "I'm tired of being hungry. I'm tired of being thirsty. I'm tired of being roasted by the sun most of the day and freezing at night. I've screwed up. I picked the wrong people. I thought that if Dave and I were the strongest guys on the island and my nerds were the smartest, we'd get the best of both worlds. Turns out my nerds are useless. They have 3 or 4 PhDs for 2 of them, but who needs a degree in particle physics when you're stuck on an island in the middle of nowhere? Then I thought we had all the women and it turns out you somehow kept the prettiest one for yourself. I think we need to share some of the resources on this island to make it fair for everyone. You and the other old man are obviously the brains here, and your girlfriend is a hunter and gatherer. If I take her, I'll get food, and since you want her back, you'll build me a place to live or even give me your own, won't you, Pops?" "No," said I. He spat again. "The fat lady comes in every day to chat with her friends. And while those stupid girls are chatting with her, I'm eavesdropping. I know they all want to come and stay with you guys. I've heard all there about not having food. Dana used to bring them little bits of squirrel and fish, and she was talking about all of you guys. I know what the fat lady is doing to the other old man, and I know you and the little English girl didn't do anything. But you like each other. So all you have to do is decide if you're going to build me a house like yours or just give yours away." "No," repeated I. "So you're not even going to try to get her back?" he asked. "I won't have to," I said. "You're not taking her." Before I could say a word, I couldn't. A huge fist came out of nowhere and slammed into my mouth with such force that I recoiled. "I guess you didn't have the intelligence to see this coming," he grumbled. "You're smart and all, but it's about time someone showed you your place here." As soon as I stood up, he punched me again, this time his first hitting me in the eye. "Stop," a woman's voice said. "Don't hit him again. I'll go with you. I'll fish and bring you berries and anything else you want. Just leave him alone, smart girl," he said. He stood over me and I hadn't fought since high school. "No," repeated I. I exaggerated my lack of balance, rising to my feet. "I have to admit, for an old man, you've got balls," he laughed. "You're the only one here who can stand up to me." I clenched my fist and swung at him clumsily. I missed him by a mile on purpose. "We don't have to do that, Pops," he said. "I'm curious about one thing, though. Why are you so willing to fight for her even though you wouldn't fight for your own wife?" "It's easy," I said, still trying to stay on my feet. "Ella's worth it." I stepped close to him and clenched my fist again. He smiled. I threw my fist out clumsily and he leaned back. Then I pulled back and kicked him in the balls with all my might. I was sure his scream could be heard all over Lake Superior and all the way home. When he leaned forward to grab his aching arm weights, I brought my knee up and punched him in the face. He spit out a couple teeth and tried to grab me. I punched him in the side with my fist and he went down. His outstretched arm crunched as he fell to the rocky ground. His sidekick looked at me shocked. "You were faking it," he said. "You weren't so out of it." "That's cheating," I laughed. He's 6 inches taller than me, he weighs more than me, probably 80 pounds, and he has a lot more options than I do. Plus he's 20 years younger and in better physical shape. You call that a fair fight? He was desperate, Dave said. We don't know about surviving. Troy always had a temper and always thought he should be in charge. When we were on the boat, you were always the one who figured out what we should do. Even during a storm, Troy would scream like a girl. It embarrassed him. And after that, he had to work up the courage while you went off to find the island. He turned the whole thing into a popularity contest and had his own little election. You should have agreed with him, but you just left us there. I think you were more angry with your wife than anything else. And you can't blame Troy for your wife. He's a guy. She proposed, he accepted. She's not even his type. She's too old for us. It was just fun. I thought it was cool because it meant I got Blondie with water wings. Now that's a disappointment. Screw you, Dave, the blonde hissed. You've done this before several times. Dave said. And it's not that great. The blonde, who didn't look as good without makeup at all, stood and grunted. At that moment, Troy woke up. Dude, are you okay? Dave asked. Troy tried to get up and suddenly screamed so loudly he almost passed out. What's the matter with your nuts now? Dave asked. That's my arm. Troy wheezed. I could see that the arm was dislocated. I grabbed his shoulders, trying not to move his arm. He recoiled from me even as I touched him. Watch it. I snapped back. Your shoulder is out of its socket. The longer it stays that way, the worse the pain and damage will be. What are you going to do? He asked. If you lie down and shut up, I'll put him back in the socket or try to, I said. I grabbed his arm and planted both feet against his side. I yanked quickly and very hard. He screamed again and then let out a gasp. Oh, that feels good. He said you need to make a bandage for your arm. I said it will be very sore for the next week or so, and after the pain goes away, it will be weaker than the other for a while. You should go back to your part of the island and rest. Dave helped him to his feet and they all left. As they left, there was discontent in the hall. I suspected that a new leader was about to emerge. Ella threw one look at my face and ran off. Just let her go, Dana said from behind me. What did I do wrong? I asked. Absolutely nothing, Dana said. Now she's even more crazy about you. You got beat up when you tried to protect her. Do you know what that does to a woman? When did she have time to get crazy about me? I asked. Yeah, since the first night you told her how much you enjoyed listening to her talk, she said. Rob, do you know what women hear all the time? I mean, didn't you listen to what Dave was saying about Becky? Do you have any idea how much pain she's in right now? Trust me, when it comes to Ella, you can do no wrong. I continued working on the mirror. I fixed it and tried to aim the beam at the edge of the cliff and at the water. I was starting to remember that we missed breakfast when I heard a few cautious footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Ella. She was holding 2 wide square boards that Dana had prepared for us as plates. On them lay something green and some kind of meat. It was cut into chunks. We ate 3 or 4 pieces, and there were cups of berry juice for each of us. She looked at me, then quickly looked away. What did I do? I asked. Rob. Your eye, she said. And your lip. They'll heal, I said. But they didn't have to do that, she said. I could have fished for him for a couple days and found berries for him. Maybe he'd learn to fish for himself and maybe I didn't want to stay away from you for a couple days. I said. Her eyes got really wide and she had to hide a smile. The greens are completely different, she says. I saw them growing underwater near where I fish. I had Jill go in the water and cut them down. It looks like kale, but it has a slightly different flavor. I realized she wanted to change the subject. So what kind of meat is this? I asked. Try it, she smiled. I took a bite from one of the pieces. It was different from the protein. It was less fatty and tasted more like chicken, but I knew there were no chickens on the island. Is that seagull? I asked, chewing and trying to figure out what the flavor was. She shook her head. Don't tell me it's a pigeon, I said, taking another bite. IgG caught it. She said it's a snake. I quickly spit it out and took a sip of the berry juice. Rob, do you know when I first realized you cared about me? She asked. I shook my head. When you told me you wanted me to eat any kind of protein, even if it tasted like fried. You didn't say that to anyone else. It was just so important to you that I stay healthy, so now I want you to eat your snake for me. It's not as tasty as fish, but it's protein and it's better than fried. From that moment on, something happened between us. We never talked about it or stated it, but we were together. We also never broke up. Since we did not know how to store food or preserve it, we began to give the surplus to another group. The first time we showed up with a bucket of fried fish and greens, they pounced on the food and devoured it by the handful. Unlike us, they had no idea about sharing or working together. Each of them just grabbed as much food as they could and retreated. A few days later, Ella and I were sitting on a rock in the morning. She was fishing. We haven't had sex since we started dating, but at least we'd kissed. So that morning, as she sat fishing and smiled back at me, I knew that eventually we would lie down on the soft grass and make love. I love you so much, I said. Not even for this boat, she said. What kind of boat? I asked. I stood on my feet and looked at the water, and she was right. It wasn't very big, but it was moving. I ran over to the mirror and shined the beam on the boat. At first I thought it would sail by, but it slowed down and then Ella and I started jumping up and down to signal them. The boat turned toward us. Jill heard our shouts and ran up to us. As the boat approached the rocks, we saw that it was a very small motorboat. It was probably not more than 10 feet long, and there were already 3 men on board. IgG and Dana came running. They had heard Ella and me screaming. Ella didn't have time to cover herself from the excitement and IgG's eyes almost rolled to his forehead. We decided that we could only send one man with them. It was immediately decided that it should be Gil. They wanted me to go, but I refused. Jill could tell the authorities about the boat, its registration number, insurance information, and other nonsense. They also radioed our location to the Coast Guard, but cell phones in that area just didn't work. Why didn't you go? Ella asked as we watched Jill set sail on the boat. And leave you? I asked. That's never going to happen. Good answer, she said. When Dana and IgG disappeared again to do whatever they were doing when they weren't around, Ella and I headed to the other side of the island. As soon as we arrived, everyone gathered around. Before we could start talking, there was a slight gasp. I looked up and saw that Natalie had noticed that Ella and I were holding hands. Where's the food? One of the nerds asked. You'll soon have all the food you need, I said. We've been rescued. What? How? Asked Dave. Mirror, I said. Ella and I were fishing on a cliff when she spotted a boat. Using the mirror, I signaled her. The boat was too small to take more than one person, so we sent Jill. They're going to send a rescue boat. All of them were thrilled, and we heard a lot of talk about what some of them would like to do first. Upon their return, there was talk about other things as well. I heard someone ask if Ella always sits in her underwear. I also heard someone ask what we do on the rocks alone in the mornings. Who cares? Someone else said it's over, we're going home. A little over 2 hours later, I stood leaning against the rail of a Great Lakes rescue boat. As I watched the island slowly recede, I could still make out the spot where we had made camp. I wondered what would become of our little cabin. $1 for your thoughts, said a tiny voice beside me. His harsh British accent made the mispronounced phrase even more unusual. My thoughts are worth at least $5, I said. Can I do the fortune-telling first? She asked. That's a lot of money, especially for a poor librarian. Okay, I said. I've been talking to Dana. She went back to her friends. She and IGG met up and talked. He explained to her very nicely that what they had would always be special to him, but it was just something that happened while we were on the island. In real life, it would never have lasted. She told him that she absolutely agreed with him and that he was too old for her, so she would go back to being a walking around the bars and he would go back to his wife. The island was just an interlude, nothing more. She said, looking at me. I nodded my head. Is that what you've been doing? She asked, trying to think of a good way to tell me about it. Something like that, I said. I watched her try and fail to keep a calm expression on her face. I've been thinking that after the wedding, we should rent a boat and come here for our honeymoon. Only I can't decide if we should invite some friends along. And of course, if we have kids, we should bring them here someday. And of course, the kids I already have might want to see it, depending on which side they take in the divorce. And the next thing I knew, she was lunging at me with such force that I nearly fell over the railing. I turned around and saw Natalie standing behind me. Ella, do I get a chance to talk to Rob? She asked. Ella only nodded. I'll go and try to comfort poor Dana, she said. Is she on the list? Definitely, I said, and an idea popped into my head. Rob, what's going on? She asked. You haven't said more than 10 words to me since you let me know that you know what I did. We need to talk about this. I talked to Dana when we were on the island. She told me some things that just don't make sense. I think you have the wrong idea about what happened here, Natalie. As soon as this boat pulls into the dock, I'm filing for divorce. If you tell me what you want to tell me, it will save me time. Let's do it. It means we won't have to waste time doing it later. I said okay. Rob, I don't know how you found out, but yes, I cheated on you before we came to the island. But I dropped everything myself and decided to dedicate the rest of my life to making you happy. That's why we went on that damn boat. I wanted us to fall in love all over again. I left Rob. I was never going to do it again. It had to mean something. She said. Yes, I said, and she smiled. It doesn't mean anything mathematically. 0 is something. What else did you want to say? Well, you know Troy made us all do it with him and the other guys. And even as she said it, she realized I knew she was lying. Nat, how do you think I found out about you having fun with Troy and you cheating on me? I asked. Dana told you, right? She said no, Nat, you told me, I said, before you came out with Troy against me, what you did to the captain. I was there in the bushes. I saw everything. I heard you telling him about your affair. Funny how a guy I can't stand cared more about our marriage than you did. I heard him ask you. What about your husband, Rob? I was scared. She whimpered. I wished I had a better chance of surviving. Yeah, but you picked the wrong one, I said. And I suffered for it, Rob, she said they treated us like. Allah only had to do it with you. She must have loved it. Natalie, Ella and I haven't had sex yet, I said. I think we're going to abstain until we get married. You can't be serious, she said. You're not seriously thinking of divorcing me, are you? That's the plan, I said. Just like Steve and Eddie's, Rob, Steve and Edie are nothing like us at all. They haven't been married that long and they don't have 2 kids to explain things to. So okay, I've had sex with a few guys the whole time I was messing around with Edie. It was all fun. It was just sex and there were no steady partners. I never embarrassed you or did anything with anyone we knew. So what? Said I. So it wasn't just your fault, but mine as well, she snapped back. I waited 20 years for you. Every day I was stuck in this house while you went to work. I was bored. I felt like an incomplete person. Tell that to Oprah or Dr. Phil. I snapped back after our divorce is final. Write a book and host The View. But don't give me that crap. It's such a cliché. I left the house every day and busted my to give you what you wanted. I bought the house in the neighborhood you wanted to live in. I got you the car you wanted to drive. When you asked for like that, you got to pay for it. My part of paying for it was working my off to pay for it. Your part was taking care of the house and watching the kids. If you wanted to change or wanted to get a job yourself, all you had to do was say something. All you had to do was say, honey, I want to get a job and help out. Even if your job only paid for daycare, it would be virtually break even. You can sit here and tell me all these excuses, but you can't say you were bored. She looked at me like she'd never thought about it. Well, what you're doing isn't the same as what I did. She snapped back. I've had a few innocent, meaningless flings with guys I don't even remember, and you went and found a woman to replace me. I laughed. Are you laughing because you don't think your relationship with Ella is serious? She asked, okay, how much time do you need with her before your wounded pride allows us to be together again? Natalie, Ella can never replace you, I said. She smiled. Ella is younger than you, smarter than you, prettier than you, better built than you've ever been. And the biggest difference, and most important, is that she believed in me. Before we even met, she listened to me and Troy and decided to be on my side when my own wife didn't. And speaking of timing, I want to spend the rest of my life with her. What do we tell our friends? What will we tell the children? She whined. I don't want to end up like Edie. You can tell them whatever you want, I said. I'm going to tell them the truth. Once we entered the docks, the race was really on. I had already told Natalie that I intended to keep the house, so she needed to make other arrangements, and since she couldn't afford the mortgage anyway without a job or substantial child support, she agreed. She decided to move in with her parents and pick up her stuff. On Saturday, I got in my Mustang and drove home. While I was there, I called the same divorce lawyer Steve had used. Steve ended up paying Edie almost nothing. And that's what I was hoping for, too. I had one more trick up my sleeve. Two, actually. While I was busy separating bank accounts and canceling all the credit cards Natalie had used, she chose a different tactic. She called our children and told them a bunch of ridiculous lies. She hired her own attorney and tried to challenge every agreement I proposed. We went to a psychologist. Even our therapist was shocked by Natalie's actions. Counseling was unsuccessful, but it took 8 weeks. As a last attempt to avoid going to court, we went to arbitration. I finally realized what Natalie was trying to accomplish. Edie was suing Steve. She decided that if she couldn't save their marriage, she would get as much money as she could. Then she would use that money to sleep with all the guys she wanted. The judge didn't give her as much as she expected, and even then it was limited to 2 years. After a few months of having all the fun she wanted, Edie found that being a full-time wasn't as much fun as she thought it would be. Plus, she was lonely and money was tight. Natalie saw this and tried to act differently. She was doing everything she could to delay the divorce as long as possible. She thought that if she could hold out long enough, I would take her back. She also had our children, her parents, and many of our friends to whom she told the same lies. In an attempt to convince me to get back together with her, I begged her to accept one of my settlement offers just to get it over with. The arbitrator was beginning to get frustrated with Natalie's behavior too. Eventually, he simply asked her what she wanted, figuring that was a good place to start the negotiations. Natalie continued to make the most outrageous demands and said that if she couldn't have it, she wanted to stay married. One of her demands was $2 million a year for 10 years. Since I make less than $100,000 a year, this was ridiculous. The arbitrator wrote a note to the judge about Natalie's behavior and sent us back to court. Natalie didn't realize it, but going to court was the worst possible option for her and the best possible option for me. Our children, now adults, came to court. None of them had spoken to me since Natalie had slung her slop at them. There, in the courtroom, in front of our parents and children, Natalie made her last statement. The first witness my lawyer called was Natalie's ex-girlfriend, Edie. By the time Edie finished telling me about what Nat had been doing behind my back, my son was furious and my daughter was crying. Neither of them believed Nat's story anymore. When the second witness was called, Natalie slumped even further in her chair. She had asked her lawyer not to let Troy testify, but the judge wanted to hear what he had to say when Troy finished laying out everything Natalie had done on the island. Even I was stunned. The judge had used every discretion he had in determining the settlement. According to state rules, all assets must be divided equally, but he was allowed a little leeway on how to do it. I had already given Natalie half of the checking and savings accounts and allowed her to keep all the things in the house she wanted. He let her keep the car, let me buy her out of the mortgage, and gave her a total of $1.00 a week for 2 years as alimony. Natalie had already spent the money from our checking and savings accounts that she had been given, and it put her in a tight spot. Since we had taken out a second mortgage to provide college tuition for both kids, we didn't have much equity in the house. Natalie had to pay her own legal fees, and although her attorney stretched out the divorce at Natalie's request, he still charged her for his time. In the end, Natalie was left on the losing end. Our house was worth $110,000. We owed $30 on it, another $40 on our second mortgage. That meant our total equity in the house was $40,000. I gave Natalie $20,000. She owed her lawyer $22,000 to help her. I offered to pay her all of her child support in one lump sum. I gave her 5 crisp $20 bills and 16 quarters and left her. Almost 6 months after I got out of court, I found myself back on the docks. As Ella and I looked at the huge ship moored there, she squeezed my hand. "Daddy," Ella shouted. Someone behind us, my daughter Susan, ran up and hugged us both. She introduced us to a small, quiet man who turned out to be her boyfriend and boarded the ship. Her grandparents on both sides were already on board. It still shocked me that I remained relatively close to Natalie's parents, but after all, they were my children's grandparents. Egg and his wife were smiling at me from the upper deck. I shook my head and Ellen nudged me with her elbow. "Be polite," she said. Dana came in with a guy who looked like Jill. How they ended up together would have to be explained later. Troy and Dave arrived, both accompanied by pretty college girls. The events on the island had changed a lot of things in their lives. The nerds arrived alone. My son was already on the island. He chartered a helicopter and flew there. It was part of our backup plan. The only people who were with us on the island and not in attendance were 3 of Dana's friends. They all felt they had been mistreated there and didn't want to remember it. And of course, Natalie wasn't there. Not that she didn't want to be. But after our divorce, things didn't go well for Nat. Most of the men she dated weren't very good. Besides, the money for her secretary job didn't pay very well. So she couldn't afford a nice dress, but the most important reason was that she was in prison. She felt betrayed by Edie because of her testimony in court. Edie, in turn, felt abandoned by Natalie during her own divorce. So although they were birds of the same feather, they very rarely got together. A few nights ago, however, they had gone to the same bar and got into a fight over the same guy. The judge gave them each a week in jail for property damage, disturbing the peace, mutual assault, and public drunkenness. As the big ship pulled away from the dock, a second smaller ship followed us at a distance. I wanted to see our little island again. I wanted us to get married there. And while everyone else slept in comfort on the ship, Ella and I would spend the first night of our honeymoon in our shawl. Then we'd get on a helicopter and fly back in time for a real honeymoon in Vegas. $1 for your thoughts? Ella said from beside me. Oh, I don't have to pay for them anymore. In a couple hours we'll be married and together forever. I would never do anything to lose you. I love you too much. I could listen to you talk forever, I said. But what I'm really remembering is how we fought with Troy over you on the island. Remember what I called that place? Yeah, you called it Gilligan's Island, she said, laughing. No, I was talking about the land of Gilligan. Me. Maybe the three of us should find out how to buy it. Maybe not, she said. But we lived happily ever after. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next